Hello everybody, and welcome to the second of 3 Michael Russell keynotes at the Global Forum on Nicotine 2021, honouring the memory of the pioneering psychiatrist who did so much for the field we now recognise as tobacco harm reduction. Before introducing our speakers this afternoon, I would just like to start with a thank you, and that's to our wonderful GFN conference team in Poland. We are missing you all lots. But don't worry, everybody, they've not got their feet up. Paddy has made sure of that. Together with our brilliant on-site AV team, they're responsible for broadcasting the conference to all of you at home. So thank you, team. You are all doing a great job. As you've already been witness to, the Global Forum on Nicotine provides a platform for open discussion about the challenges, controversies, and obstacles that stand in the way of progress on tobacco harm reduction. This afternoon's keynote from John Fell of Ash Park is going to tackle one of the elephants that often lurks in the room: money. John is a founder of Ash Park, an investment management company, and he focuses on the fast-moving consumer goods industry, including the tobacco sector. His CV also mentions some city names that you'll recognise, including Deutsche Bank, Morgan Stanley, and Merrill Lynch. I suspect his handle on numbers is significantly better than mine. As John put it in his abstract, the development of reduced harm tobacco and nicotine products, with some major contributions from small and independent firms, has blurred old certainties about what's good and what's bad. Investors have played a part in the evolution of the nicotine market by providing next-generation startups with funds and as key stakeholders in the larger companies. John will be considering what risks and rewards there may be for public health in investment in nicotine innovation. After John has concluded his talk, I will be delighted to ask David Sweena to offer a response. Familiar to many of you, David is an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law and chair of the advisory board of the Centre for Health, Law, Policy and Ethics at the University of Ottawa. Actively involved in tobacco and health policy issues since the beginning of the 1980s, David played a key role in achieving many global precedents in tobacco policy. When he isn't busy riding his bike for hundreds of kilometres, David focuses his activity on risk reduction strategies. But for now, it's over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I'm honoured to be here today. As Ruth said, at Ash Park we run a consumer fund, and you should know that we have some positions in tobacco stocks there, and my own money is invested in that fund. But I'm here with a couple of other hats as well, which you should know about. First of all, I'm a consumer. In the past, I would have called myself someone who smoked socially, and I still do sometimes, but these days I'm more likely to get my nicotine from vaping. The third hat, well, I've watched Swedish Match and the evolution of the story around snus since the late 90s, and I'm a strong believer in harm reduction. I need to add that nothing I say today should be interpreted as investment advice, and it's not intended as investment advice. So if you can move on a slide. Oh, I'll get the hang of this in a sec. Can we go back one? I'm going to take things as given, things like the risk continuum, and that products such as e-cigarettes, pouches, tobacco heating really do deliver a lot less harm than combustible cigarettes. I'm going to do some scene setting on who the industry is today, the part played by investors, what's driving change across the industry and within the companies themselves, and conclude by looking at the risks and rewards to public health from what's going on. And I'm going to start with a question. We can move on to the next slide. Does the discourse on the tobacco industry, especially its portrayal as a kind of cartoon villain, big tobacco, does that hold back the cause of tobacco harm reduction? And the term conjures up the image of US CEOs being dragged in front of congressional hearings in '94. And it evokes all the well-known misbehaviors of the US companies that came out in leaked documents and court cases. It might once have been a useful campaigning caricature, but it preserves in aspic perceptions of the industry from nearly 30 years ago relating to events that occurred often decades before that. It's very US-centric. What about the other parts of the world where cigarettes were sold by governments or independent companies? It obscures how the lines between legacy tobacco and new nicotine businesses have become blurred, and how even the largest companies can pursue very different strategies. It erects a barrier to dialogue and an excuse for failing to understand these companies. Who wants to associate with evil lying geniuses? Most importantly, the inference that the public health problem of tobacco consumption is all or largely the industry's fault short-circuits critical thinking about why people use these products. It denies individual agency in the pursuit of pleasure. There's a line in Carl Hart's great new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. He says, "The war on drugs is not a war on drugs, it's a war on us." Too often the war on tobacco seems to become a war on the people who use tobacco or nicotine. The largest public companies inevitably attract most attention. Can we have the next slide? This one shows the relative sizes by market capitalization, dominated by PMI and Altria, very definitely two different companies, and BAT. But note the appearance at numbers 4 and 9 of the Chinese vaping businesses, Small and RLX, and how JT and Imperial, which are the world's 4th and 5th largest cigarette companies by volume, has slipped down the rankings. Now, the total market capitalization represented here is 536 billion at the end of May. That sounds a lot, but to put it in context, that's only about a quarter of what Apple is worth. And if you look at the tobacco sector's weight in a global equity index, it's just over 0.6%. Also note that this covers less than half of the global nicotine market. State monopolies like China, which is not far off half in itself, are missing, and loads of smaller independent companies, some in combustibles, but increasingly also in reduced harm products, right down to vape store chains and independent vaping stores. The question of ownership is another area where cliches on tobacco can be wide of the mark. The largest publicly owned companies here, they're not controlled by some secret cabal. They're largely owned by the same people who own the rest of the stock market via pension funds, retirement accounts, an equity index or tracker funds. That boils down to individuals like you and me, a broad swathe of society. Next slide. A common misconception is that the only concern of companies is to maximize profits. Now, a simple way to value shares is to look at the price earnings or PE ratio, which is the share price divided by the profits or earnings per share. And that earnings multiple reflects a range of factors, including growth and market discount rates. But it also includes investor perceptions of quality, the risks the business faces, how long it's likely to be around and growing. From a share price perspective, it's no good companies only growing their profits. They also have to protect that perceived quality of their business. Next one. Now, it's maybe surprising how volatile that PE ratio can be, how perceived quality can change so rapidly, but it does. And what you've got here is a share price chart for the global tobacco sector over the last 25 years. Ignoring the dip in 2008-9, which is the global financial crisis, which hit everything, tobacco has faced two very painful periods when the PE ratio compressed. In the first one, at the end of the 90s, tobacco share prices fell 65%, almost all driven by the PE moving from 15 to 6.5. That was because of fears over the impact of US litigation, and also partly because of odd investor behaviour relating to the bubble in telecoms, media and technology stocks. And we've been through something pretty similar in the last few years. From early June 2017 to the end of March last year, the tobacco index dropped 54%, again almost entirely driven by the PE moving from a bit over 20 to just over 9. The very tail end of that was driven by a COVID-related dip in the overall equity market, but most was due to three other factors. Firstly, fears over to the extent to which new nicotine products like e-cigarettes, tobacco heating, were disrupting the market and the profit stream of combustible cigarettes. Juul's growth was something that particularly grabbed the headlines because that threat came from a company outside the incumbents. Second was regulatory concerns. In fact, the beginning of that PE slide corresponds with the FDA's announcement that it would look at lowering nicotine levels in US cigarettes to non-addictive levels, and you've got menthol bans in that mix as well. And then thirdly, you've had a rise in the extent to which investors are taking into account environmental, social, governance, or ESG factors in their decisions about what to own. You can see how painful the last 4 years will have been for many senior executives in the tobacco industry who not only own significant amounts of the stock from the companies they run, but whose long-term incentive plans, packages also often heavily reflect the relative performance of their own company's stock price versus the rest of the stock market. You think that stabilising and improving the PE, the perceived quality of their business, would be quite a priority for them. I'll come on to ways they might be addressing that in a second, but first, on the next slide, a little bit on the trends in ESG, or socially responsible investing. There's a massive amount of interest in that at the moment. Big flows of money into funds managed according to ESG criteria, especially in Europe, where one figure I saw recently suggests it now accounts for around half of all fund inflows. Many people probably associate socially responsible investing with refusing to invest in things you don't like. Tobacco usually falls in that bucket. Weapons, human rights violators are other common ones. Sometimes alcohol. From what I've seen, the majority of ESG funds take that divestment approach to tobacco and exclude it. But you don't have to do it that way. You can decide to invest in the best in class of a particular group of companies. You can decide to encourage or harass the companies you own into improving what's called engagement. It's what we believe in at Ash Park, and it's part of the reason I'm here today. One of the standard bearers for the tobacco divestment approach is the Tobacco-Free Portfolios Initiative, which started in Australia, and whose pledge now has 162 institutional signatories, mostly from Australasia, from Benelux, France, and Scandinavia. Tobacco-Free Portfolios says that tobacco stands out as an exception, even amongst other controversial sectors, demanding, they say, exclusion from financing and investment. Positive influence of the industry through professional engagement is futile, as the only acceptable outcome would be for tobacco companies to cease their primary business. Note that in another part of their documentation, their toolkit, they ask themselves the question, what about freedom of choice? Don't people have the right to smoke? To which their response is, yes, of course they do. I respect those whose personal moral views mean they don't want to own tobacco stocks, but I equate the divestment in all circumstances approach to a bit of an abdication of responsibility. It might make the seller feel good, but it doesn't really address the underlying problem. There's still a tobacco business there. If a less scrupulous group of investors ends up owning the shares instead, the effects could even be counterproductive. If public market valuations imply that they won't be in business for very long, then companies might become more focused on maximising short-term profits. Shareholder engagement with controversial companies recently hit the headlines in the fossil fuels sector, with activists winning battles against ExxonMobil, Chevron and Shell. Is tobacco uniquely toxic as an industry, even compared to oil and gas? We want oil companies to transition their business models towards cleaner energy and reduced carbon emissions. And don't we also want to encourage tobacco companies to shift their business as much as they can towards reduced harm forms of tobacco and nicotine use? However well they do on climate or on the environment, it's the health impact of their products which is the overwhelming ESG concern in tobacco. And investors need help on how to think about that. The WHO FTC-driven approach of tobacco-free portfolios, engagement is futile, with no apparent recognition that reduced harm tobacco and nicotine products might exist, doesn't really help. So I was encouraged to see last year the first edition of the Tobacco Transformation Index published, which was organised by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And that ranked the world's largest tobacco companies according to the degree to which they're transforming in terms of progress so far, also how much effort they're putting in to change things further. It can no doubt be improved in various ways, but it's a big step forward for me in providing investors with an externally substantiated outline on how best to approach engagement with the industry. Moving on, here's what I think is particularly wrong with the cartoon villain caricature of tobacco companies. First, although the companies mostly survive as legal entities, the managers and personnel are completely different to those of 30 years ago. I wonder if you can say the same of the thought leaders in tobacco control. Altria is on its 7th CEO since that '94 congressional testimony. The current one was born well after health warnings went on US cigarette packs. Second, linking to that ESG theme, society's expectations are changing. Regulation's one of the things that flows from that too. But I'd agree with Charles Gardner, who said in his video presentation that the law of diminishing returns is starting to kick in when it comes to those traditional tobacco control policies. Third, the science and evidence bases have evolved, along with the range of products on offer. In the early 2000s, the amount of available evidence on tobacco harm reduction, starting with snus, really started to accelerate. And then you had a massive external shock in the invention and subsequent popularization of e-cigarettes and vaping. An important element too has been the impact of investment in reduced harm products from outside the tobacco industry. Think back to Small and RLX or Juul, major businesses which didn't exist not so long ago. I was reminded, reading one of the new books about Juul, that they had difficulties getting funding because many of the Silicon Valley venture capital firms, which are now deluging other startups with cash, have so-called vice clauses, which stop them investing in tobacco and nicotine. Perhaps the impact of external capital on reduced harm products could be, even bigger if somehow that stigma could be removed. So what do you do if you're a tobacco company board watching this? These people, I don't think, want to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors, and it would be a very stupid company that didn't react to change. You can't really sit there and do nothing, nor can you, as some suggest, just stop selling cigarettes. Your shareholders wouldn't let you, And a unilateral decision like that, I don't think would stop anyone smoking. You can't just abandon consumers like that. You could diversify, but large-scale acquisitions of other types of business have been tried before and don't really work. You've still got the legacy tobacco problem there. More sensible, incremental movement into other categories or adjacencies like cannabis, caffeine, other other plant-based products, maybe respiratory drug delivery, or biotech with a focus on the tobacco plant and things like vaccine development. And you are starting to see those things from the likes of BAT and PMI. But, ultimately, you don't really have any choice but to adapt and transform your legacy tobacco business, even if you incur lots of hostility in doing so. These are very difficult questions for companies to address, which are not just about profits. The key one is, how far can you push your consumers? What attitude do you take to the ones that say, I don't like these new products, I want to carry on smoking? To those who enjoy it and for whom smoking is a big part of their identity. It's a messy process too. There are going to be board disputes, disputes across management teams. Everyone's going to make some mistakes and has made some mistakes. Big companies across different industries tend not to be very good at innovating, at being first movers. What they're better at is taking somebody else's idea and then scaling it. When tobacco company reduced harm products aren't a success, it's not, as I sometimes hear suggested, because they've somehow been designed to fail in order to protect the cigarette business. I don't know even how that would even work. It's because making good products with mass consumer appeal is actually really hard. And that's before we consider all the thorny regulatory and political hurdles which are out there. To finish off, one more slide, I think. Because of the many tensions, we shouldn't be surprised that companies don't all end up in the same place. Across the publicly quoted universe, you've now got RLX and Small making all their revenues from vaping. You've got Swedish Match continuing to shift its business mix towards smokeless tobacco and nicotine pouches. Then you've got the largest cigarette companies where some big differences are emerging. Philip Morris International generated nearly 30% of its revenues from non-combustible products in the most recent quarter. It was under 1% 5 years ago, and it aims to get to 50% by 2025. BAT is at about 12% of its revenues from non-combustible products, also with some quite ambitious targets for growth in that part of its business. And then you've got Japan Tobacco and Imperial, who've so far struggled to make real progress. It's relatively easy to spend a lot of money. The hard part is to get consumers to come along with you. The critical thing to note is that investors really do care. This is maybe slightly oversimplified, but if you look at the x-axis here, which shows the PE, that quality metric, you can see that the market is putting a much higher valuation on companies that are making that transition away from combustible products. And of course, the companies and their executives notice that too, and it's reflected in the incentive plans of a couple of them, PMI and BAT. Next slide, last slide. It won't surprise you to hear that I think there's a lot of upside from industry involvement, investment in harm reduction. If we can move the discourse beyond that big tobacco mental model and refocus the conversation on a more open-minded conversation and look at what consumers want. But there are risks too. And at the top I've put discomfort, which is probably stealing from Joe Gitchell. Discomfort because it challenges the idea that public health is united against a common enemy. I've seen a lot of laments recently about consensus in the tobacco control community having been broken, requests to find common ground by continuing to marginalise the tobacco industry. But aren't real progress and intellectual honesty more important than unity? And isn't it actually quite common to see these types of debates when paradigms are evolving? There's discomfort too that the harm reduction cause is tainted by a connection with the tobacco industry, and a dislike, I think, of big business muscling in on a territory that once belonged to smaller pioneers, particularly in vaping. And I see some people going through almost Jesuitical contortions deciding which vaping products to like based on who sells them. But what about the consumers? Are they less worthy if they've chosen a tobacco industry vaping brand or a heated tobacco product or a nicotine pouch? And what about the 35% of s'mores revenue made by its biggest customer? Are they no good because that customer is BAT? Is being hostile to reduced harm products because of who makes them really much different to the opponents of tobacco harm reduction, framing tobacco industry involvement as a reason to dismiss it? There are some, positives though that I want to finish on. Oh, sorry, a couple more things. Yeah, some things to really actually focus on, and maybe more genuine concerns. First of all, irresponsible marketing. It's a tough one because you don't want to cut off all the marketing edge, which might help consumers to switch to something better. To me, the larger tobacco businesses are relatively cautious when it comes to marketing reduced harm products, and it's the smaller startup companies that take more risks and who've caused some problems. A couple of other areas where you should maybe be vigilant as well and call out poor behaviour. First of all, regulation and attempts to use that to close off competition. I've no doubt tobacco companies made some mistakes early on, but company attitudes aren't all the same, and they've evolved. It's a dangerous game to hope that regulation will bail out your business. There's no substitute for giving consumers something they actually want. And then, as we heard in the last section as well, there's a danger that consumers in lower and middle income countries get left behind when it comes to tobacco harm reduction. People should keep on the industry's back about that, and also on the backs of those at the WHO and Bloomberg organisations whose role in restricting consumer choice in these markets seems to be quite large. The positives. For me, a major side effect of the growth in vaping is that nicotine consumers have found their voice again. This is a real grassroots movement. One of the things that's highlighted is the role of pleasure. This is not just about curing someone with a medical condition. People want to be stimulated, given access to pleasure, not cured. And that's something that consumer companies are expert at. The profit motive can really be a very powerful force for public health if you accept the concept of consumers seeking pleasure. And that's not just about big business. Think about the vape shops in many countries now that offer effectively stop smoking services. Think about the scale that business has to reach consumers and the amount of resource it can put behind marketing reduced harm products. There's an enormous amount of expertise and information available from tobacco companies in their science publications and on their websites, and also in the information they give investors. And I have to say that on this topic, I end up trusting tobacco company sources more than I do, sad to say, the WHO, the European Commission, or some academic journal articles. Executives can be prosecuted or lose their jobs if they mislead investors. And the good thing about the information is it's up to the minute too, particularly relative to the typical journal publication cycle. And that's really important when consumer trends in reduced harm products are moving so quickly. Finally, do use investors who ultimately control these companies, they control how much the managers get paid, to get your case across and to press for progress. There's a lot of intellectual curiosity in the investment world, a lot of influence, and a lot of people who find the just sell tobacco and wash your hands of it approach dissatisfying. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. I'd now like to pass over to David, who I'm hoping is going to be joining us momentarily on the screen. There he is.
All right.
Hello, David. I'm going to pass straight to you, David. I hope you heard all of that. Please give us your response to John's fascinating talk. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ruth. I hope the audio is coming through okay.
You're good.
Excellent. Well, the audio is good. We'll decide whether I am. I'm sorry I can't be there in person again this year. Hopefully that will change. But it's very good to be participating in another GFN. I think John's presentation was fantastic. When I first got involved in trying to push for policy measures to reduce cigarette smoking, as Ruth had said earlier, beginning in the 1980s, one of the things I did was study the industry, try to understand as much as we possibly could about the industry and why it was acting the way that it does. Because ultimately, if you want to win in regulation, in politics, in courtroom litigation, you need to have a realistic view of your opponent. And the sort of stuff that John mentioned, this cartoonish caricature of the industry, it can be fun for people to have things like that. It's used at time of war to recruit people to go fight an enemy. But it's not very effective when you're actually looking at policy. And we end up with things like, as John was pointing out, with the rise of disruptive technology just in recent years because of vaping, the share prices of big tobacco declined by over half. Some of the companies dramatically, because their whole business model came under a long-term danger, very similar to what we've seen happen in areas like telecommunications, with new technology destroying the business model of existing companies. And yet, at the same time, much of mainstream tobacco control thought that vaping was a plot by big tobacco, these evil geniuses, and it had to be attacked. And the best thing we could do would be to attack these alternative products. Not recognizing what they were doing was really protecting the cigarette market, which is where these companies made massively higher profit margins on a sustainable basis. So it was that failure to grasp the reality of what's going on. And into that category, I would also put the whole question of what's going to be happening in this area of innovation on nicotine delivery. And again, this is pretty simple when you look at this from a business standpoint, and that we all know that the science is there. You can deliver nicotine in ways that's massively less hazardous than cigarettes. We see that a tremendous number of consumers are very willing to move to these products if the products are available and they have decent information. And the global market for cigarettes is approaching $1 trillion a year with over 1 billion users. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a venture capitalist, and you say, what would happen if I got into that market and for some reason I only got 0.1% of that market? And the answer is, you'd probably be a multi-billionaire. That's an incentive. The idea that you could become phenomenally wealthy, even with what looks like a very small part of a market this size, where we already know that consumers are dissatisfied, a tremendous number of smokers are dissonant. We know that products can work better. So the innovation is going to happen. It's a question of, do we try to turn that to the advantage of public health? Do we have sensible regulatory regimes that help us reduce cigarette smoking more rapidly? Or do we get tied up on some of these, I think, quite silly things like divestment, tell people don't invest in any tobacco company? Well, markets are very broad. It's very hard to get everybody to say, I will do something against my best financial interests. And even if it was possible to reduce the share price of cigarette companies on a sustained basis because of people saying, I don't want to buy them, they'd go private, meaning that they would no longer be publicly traded companies. People would decide to own them outright. And we would lose this tremendous flow of information that we get now because of them being public companies. And as John pointed out, you get a lot of information from publicly listed companies. You know, they're constantly giving information to shareholders and to analysts. They're submitting reports to the US Securities and Exchange Commission. All of that information is available. And I'd also agree with him that a lot of that information is very reliable because unlike, say, some of the things we see coming from the WHO, if you mislead the Securities and Exchange Commission, really bad things happen to you. And you know, if you publish a journal article that's a little fast and loose with the stats, doesn't really make sense and misleads people, you probably get tenure. So which source of information, you know, is going to be most valuable for us to understand? And so I think we need to be studying the industry. We need to be looking at the new players. We need to understand this is a very dynamic situation. And we need to try to shape that through intelligent regulation, through having an intelligent discourse, that to look at how did we transform other industries, like what's going on with the automotive industry now, moving away from internal combustion engines? What happened to move from unsanitary to sanitary food, from snake oil to science-based pharmaceutical products? You know, how did we transform all these other industries? What are the lessons in that for us? And what can we do by understanding how this industry operates, but also understanding who's the industry? What's the difference between companies that are selling tobacco products and companies that are selling alternative products? What's the difference between cigarettes and non-combustion tobacco products? What are the divisions between the different companies? What are the divisions within the different companies? Because that's also common. Within any of the companies, there's some personnel are going to win, there's some are going to lose if we go through a transformation. The better we understand that, the more effectively we can do cigarette smoking. So the opportunity is there. Getting this sort of information is just critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So I'm going to start by moving to one of our questions that's come in online, but I would really like the next question to be from somebody in the room. So there's your challenge. So I'm going to put this to both of you. It's a question from Sarah Tops, and she's asked, what can be done to incentivize tobacco companies to develop appropriate, safer nicotine products for low and middle income countries? So what can be done to incentivize them to do that? John, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Well, I mean, ultimately, businesses, if they're going to seek to grow the proportion of their revenues that come from non-combustible products, as we've seen from the two leaders, PMI and BAT, they're only going to get so far if it only works in the developed world. I mean, very roughly, each of those companies, both of those companies, make half their earnings, half their revenues in LMICs. So to reach what they say is their goal, they're going to have to find ways of working effectively in those countries with reduced harm products. So to some extent, that incentive's already there. And it's something that was looked at as part of that smoke-free, or tobacco transformation, I should say, rather, that I mentioned during my speech. And that also looks at how much effort is being put into developing reduced harm initiatives in LMICs. But the reason I mentioned it in my speech is because it's a difficult issue. The products which are winning at the moment, or two of the products which are winning, tobacco heating, vaping, tend to be just a bit more suited to developed markets in the way they're currently formatted. So it's also, I think, a matter of harm reduction advocates just keep hassling the companies,
Sure.
Keep hassling investors to hassle the companies as well, and hopefully we'll get more movement in that direction.
Sure, thank you. David, can you be brief
Sure.
on that one so I can move to our question from the room before we close?
Sure. The easiest way to incentivize the companies to do more, and that's the whole range of companies, current and not yet existing, is to stop banning the alternatives. I mean, what incentive do you have to try to come up with a less hazardous product when countries like India not only decide to ban the alternatives, but the World Health Organization gives them an award for doing it? So there's tremendous potential in all of these markets, and anybody who thinks that new technology cannot be acceptable in low and middle income countries needs to understand what happened with smartphones. I mean, it will work. I mean, just take away the bans, give an incentive for people to move in this direction.
Sure. Thank you very much, David. So someone has accepted my challenge. Jeannie.
Thank you. Jeannie Cameron from Jewel Labs. The opponents, tobacco control, are very good at putting forward over 20 years arguments against the industry, which has gone from smoking and now over to vaping, etc. What do both of you think that we need to do in the industry to ensure that what is happening now in terms of different companies lobbing grenades against each other in terms of whether you are a heated tobacco product, a vaping product, a pouch product, a snus product, it's all non-combustion and it all should be on the same side. There's not enough of it happening, and I think if we were actually able to come together and work together with one key message like the opponents, the tide will rise for everyone. It's not happening, but from the investment perspective and the perspective you've spoken of, what do you think needs to happen to change that? Thank you.
If I go first briefly, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Jeannie. I think there are difficulties in coming together, not least because that plays into exactly one of the big tobacco tropes that people worried about, that it's a coordinated conspiracy. You don't want to be repeating that, and you also want you want healthy competition. You want companies fighting each other to come up with better products. But I do think it would help sometimes if the companies took a step back and considered what impact the comments they make have on the perception of the whole category. I mean, it's not that long ago that I heard Imperial at a conference 5-6 years ago saying that actually tobacco heating wasn't tobacco heating, it was burning. And then 3 or 4 years later, they're selling those products and thinking they're great. I worry about that sometimes in the patent disputes we're having with, on tobacco heating. If one of those disputes caused products to be taken off the market somewhere and consumers hit, that would be pretty disastrous, I think, regardless of the sort of commercial issues at hand. So yeah, just think about the impact on the category, but yet still be very competitive, and there's maybe not a need for conscious cooperation.
Thank you. David, I must ask you, I'm so sorry to be brief on this concept of uniting the industry. Is it possible?
You don't want it. You want competition. You want the companies to be at each other's throats, I think. And all we need is one company to really go all in on this and to force the change in the marketplace. And though a lot of them have a PR effort that's saying that's what they're doing, I think if we looked at it from a criminal law perspective, if it was a criminal offense to be actively involved in trying to transform this market as rapidly as possible from cigarettes and non-combustibles, could they be convicted? I don't think any of them could yet. I'd like to get to the position where they could.
And that is that. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me extend our warmest thanks to John and to David, and I hope you will be joining us again tomorrow for day 2 of GFN. Thank you very much.